All right, welcome back everybody to Cool's Interviews. Today we got the start of a pretty exciting trilogy of interviews. This one we're going to talk about a couple books, mainly one, The Fermi Paradox is Bullshit by Ken, and I will let Ken introduce himself.
Hey everyone, I'm Ken Goudsward. I've written a few books now. I mostly like to look at weird stuff in some different forms. I've done some stuff about UFOs in this book, which is it really is about, is there any proof of, or even any evidence of extraterrestrial life. I've also got another new book that just came out that we're going to talk about next time, I guess, which is Before Roswell, which examines the long history of the UFO phenomenon. And I also have a couple of books on Sumerian mythology, as well as Hebrew legends or scriptures, however you want to think about them, which are quite fascinating because they also have a lot of indication that the UFO phenomenon is not a new one, but has been around since the beginning of recorded history.
Yeah, the term UFO definitely has some stigma around it. Honestly, I kind of feel like that's purposeful. There's so many kind of bad sightings, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but I think it helps cover everything up, if that makes sense. Before we start, though, I just had a question about something that's Paleo Hebrew, and I didn't, or supposedly Paleo Hebrew, and I wanted to get your take. Have you heard of the Los Lunas Decalogue Stone?
I have not heard of that one.
Okay.
Los Lunas Decalogue.
Yeah.
You might have to send me a link about that. That sounds interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I will definitely send you it. It's supposed to be the 10 Commandments written in Paleo Hebrew, and it's in Los Lunas, New Mexico.
Interesting. I mean, it's for sure a fact that the Ten Commandments were not written in the Hebrew that we now have. The Hebrew alphabet was not used like in the current form that the alphabet is in Hebrew right now. It was adopted from an Akkadian script, so that happened during the Babylonian exile of the Israelites, which was around 500 BC. And if we can believe the story of Moses and the Ten Commandments as any kind of a factual narrative, the dating on that would be roughly 1,000 years previous. So whatever script God used to write the Ten Commandments was not the same as what we have in the Hebrew Bible today.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting is there's so much that we really can't translate too much, and that's where it's kind of gets. And we've talked about this with other guests, where it kind of gets watered down through the times, and changed based on the person's ideas or perspectives.
For sure, so much of the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, but well, really the New Testament too, because I think if you take a look at what the stories of the Old Testament were about, and then the stories of even Jesus, in the Gospels, the stories of what Jesus was about, and then you look at the stories of what the rest of the New Testament, particularly the writings of the Apostle Paul, are about. You have three completely separate thematically driven stories. So Paul overlays stuff onto Jesus's ministry that is not there in Jesus' words and actions, and then again, those same themes are overlaid onto the even older texts that were incorporated from the Hebrew, or from the Jewish religion. That's kind of one of my long-standing projects that I'm really digging into. It began when I started writing UFOs in the Bible, which is available on Amazon, and I found a lot of really strange things where it's like, well, many of these descriptions are very clearly an eyewitness report of a UFO. However, that's not really accepted in Christianity. whether mainstream or even fringe Christianity, whatever that may happen to be, it's really not. It's not. These stories are not seen as physical objects flying in the sky. But that's clearly what the writers of the Old Testament are telling us. So instead, we overlay these other ideas, such as angels, for example, which is really interesting because in the Hebrew Old Testament, there is not a word for angel. The closest thing that we have is malaka, which is a messenger. And many of the time, those are just normal people. And then sometimes there are messengers, but they are described as coming down from the sky and usually coming out of a spaceship of some kind, like a physical object. And it's usually metal and has fire. So it's like, where did this idea of angels come from? It's not supported in the Old Testament at all. In fact, the word angel comes from a Greek word, angelos. This is at least hundreds of years later after the Hebrew accounts. You now have more of this Greek concept kind of pasted onto these old stories. And in the Greek pantheon, there are all kinds of flying humanoids, and they often have wings with feathers, and maybe just their feet have wings or whatever. So the kind of archetypal image that we might think of when we think of an angel is definitely a Greek concept. So it's interesting that the Bible has a lot of these things where our classical understanding of it is totally not supported at all. Yeah, again, that's going to be one of my biggest projects, and I'm going to turn that into a book. Whereas there's all of these, I'm finding a lot of words in Hebrew which indicate that there are other races and alien races, and that there are actually stories of these other beings migrating to Earth. And we already have a tiny chunk of that story in the book of Genesis, where in Genesis 6, they refer to the sons of the Elohim coming to Earth, coming down to Earth, and having sex with human women and fathering the Nephilim. So, literally, there's only one verse that has not been purged. Somehow they missed that when they were taking out a lot of the stories. The book of Enoch has a bunch more of that same story, but of course that was mostly purged. Depending on who you ask, is the book of Enoch in the Bible? Most people will say no, unless you're a Catholic. Maybe it is. So it's kind of fascinating. However, the book of Enoch is a really interesting thing, because if there is anywhere in the Old Testament where you do have some kind of inkling of a hint of angels, it's in the book of Enoch. Even then, they don't talk about angels, but what they do talk about is that there's like a rebellion. So it's sort of parallels with the sort of concept in Christianity of angels that were fallen angels, and so that is now what we generally would call demons. The only time that story is mentioned in all of this literature is in the book of Enoch, which is supposedly not even accepted as part of the Bible. So why is it that particular the story didn't really make it in, and yet the background information made it into the standard theology of Christianity? And in fact, it's very instrumental in terms of really the core message of Christianity in terms of salvation, because salvation is tied to sin, and sin is tied to original sin, and original sin is tied to the fall of man, and then the fall of man is tied to the fall of the demons, which never happened according to the Bible. So what gives?
Yeah, the Book of Enoch, I know when I was reading through and taking notes, that was one that stuck out to me because we did an interview a few weeks back with a gentleman named Wallace Wagner.
Right.
And And that was another book that he mentioned, and I just like the parallel and connection there. Because again, it's just like there's so many like lost texts or lost books of the Bible. And it's like,
Hmm.
well, why did they pick one and not the other, you know?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. The Book of Enoch has a lot of other weird. Sorry, go ahead.
It didn't fit their agenda.
Yeah, exactly. And yet, it's the only place that certain parts of the agenda are mentioned. So it's really weird. I think we still must be missing something in terms of what exactly it was that they were trying to get rid of. The Book of Enoch also has a section where Enoch is basically flying through space, and I haven't studied it in detail enough to make my mind up as to whether he is doing that physically in some kind of craft, or if there's any kind of evidence for the more traditional interpretation of like some kind of a spiritual experience. But even if it is, then it's more like an out of body experience, or astral traveling, rather than simply going to church and singing songs and feeling all nice. Like it's not just it's weird, whatever it is. Whatever way you interpret it, it's weird.
Kind of similar to like a Native American, like spiritual or spirit walk. And we have a buddy that's Navajo, and he hasn't divulged everything because that's supposed to be like their stuff, but he's kind of told us briefly about it, and it's kind of similar in aspects there. I know while we're on religion, Sam did have a question about a religious artifact that he wanted to ask you.
Yeah, my cousin was talking to me one time about like Jesus or Yeshua, however you want to call him, his shroud. Like his shroud was like a mystical slash like magical thing, but it's like not really mentioned. Do you know anything about the shroud?
He's probably referring to what's known as the Shroud of Turin. There's also been a couple of other claims where other people have said, "Oh no, it's not that one. It's this one." So there's actually a couple of objects floating around in which people have claimed that. Basically, the claim is that this was part of the cloth that Jesus was wrapped in when he was put into the tomb for 3 days and then rose again on the third day. I don't know if there's any basis for that at all. And even just having looked at the pictures of it and stuff like that, it doesn't look to me like what that would look like. And I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical about that particular claim. However, relates in some ways to there's a couple of other stories in the New Testament, particularly in the Book of Acts and in the Gospels as well, where Jesus and also a couple of his followers afterwards were able to heal people even without them being there. So in a couple of these instances, that was done by touching a piece of cloth and then having a messenger take that cloth to the sick person. I like to think of those two things kind of hand in hand. I guess the claim of these shrouds is that they have some kind of magical power or whatever, but I'm not sure if they are purported to be to have power of healing, or really what they're trying to do, or if everyone just thinks, hey, it's awesome, it's cool. And throughout Catholicism, there's been this long history of other types of objects that are essentially revered. And I can't remember the name they use for it now, but like, for example, there was several splinters that were supposed to be from the cross of Jesus, or like a nail that was supposed to be from the cross. And then, of course, the most famous one is the cup that Jesus supposedly used at the Last Supper, the Holy Grail. If you want an interesting take on that, check out Dan Brown's novels. Like, it's actually kind of fascinating because he presents some very different kind of alternate takes on what this the Holy Grail might be. And in that particular book, of course, it's fiction, or at least it's marketed as fiction. But in that particular book, it's not a cup at all, but it's rather it's an actual like person, like basically the idea is that Jesus had a family, which is interesting because the Bible doesn't say that Jesus didn't have a family. I don't know how much weight to put on that, but there's no indication really in any of the Gospels as to whether any of the guys were married or not, except that some of the stories took place at Peter's mother-in-law's house. So Peter was obviously married, but they never mentioned his wife. We don't know her name. There's no stories about her. There's no stories about any of the other women, although maybe there is, because there's Mary and there's the other Mary and the other Mary and Martha and Elizabeth. So there were women floating around in these stories. And, just because they're not the main characters so much, but then again, none of the guys are the main character either, except Jesus. And then going through hundreds of years of patriarchy, where it's entirely possible that male priests and bishops and popes just decided to do some gender swapping in the stories. So I don't know.
Yeah, I've read a couple interesting books about the Holy Grail. One is like Holy Blood, Holy Grail or something like that, which I think's come out to be a hoax, but a super elaborate. Like, man, that guy had some like talent. But then there's another one. I think it's Search for the Grail by Graham Phillips, which was pretty interesting too. See, we've already gotten off topic. I'm a bad host.
Yeah, well, we always will. It's all good.
So before we get into your book, do you want to kind of just describe your background? Because I know from the book you kind of describe yourself as a skeptic. So how did you go from like skeptic to this side?
Yeah, well, I don't even really know. I mean, I guess I've always been a believer in things that made sense, and for a long time, Christianity made sense to me because I was looking at it through a certain perspective. And honestly, it still makes sense in some ways, but I guess I would no longer necessarily fall under the umbrella of like a typical Christian. Whether you may choose to call me a Christian or not is up to you, I guess. I don't go to church, but I used to be a church leader. So, I mean, that says something, but I don't know what it says. So aside from that, I've always been very interested in science and as well as archaeology. I used to read when I was like 8 years old. One of my favorite books was a book about Egypt that I had. I've studied electronics and computer science and mathematics and physics, as well as anthropology and religion and a little bit of philosophy and music and lots of other stuff. So I guess I've never been one to want to limit my thinking to one specific too narrow of a field, and I've always been more of a generalist. I got to give credit to the Ancient Aliens crew. I mean, that program on the History Channel, of course, has just been, I think, really instrumental in many people's journey, I guess you could say, like, because it raises a lot of questions. And I will say that they don't always do their homework, or at least maybe they make some claims which are probably over exaggerated and not necessarily fact checked all the time, but it makes for interesting programming. And more importantly, I think what they've done, at least in my experience, how that worked was it opened up my eyes to ideas, and whether those ideas are true or not is another question. But never having even heard of many of these ideas is a problem. And so I think that if you just stick to the mainstream and just believe what CNN is trying to tell you or whatever, it's problematic, and you're really only getting very much a very controlled story of what's happening in the world. And really, if you look at the academic side of things, it's kind of the same. Like there's an agenda, and there is very much a certain way of seeing the world, and you're not really allowed to question that. And that was a real problem in Egyptology, between, I would say, it's the problem is going away now, but like for the last probably 50 years, it was very static, and very biased, and nobody really could ask questions. And so when you had guys who started to, guys like Andrew Collins, and Robert Schoch, and these guys who would start to question
Like the
some of
Sphinx.
these long established things, like, yeah, the age of the Sphinx. I mean, Robert Schoch clearly shows that there's water erosion on the base of the Sphinx enclosure. How do you get water erosion in a desert? Well, you don't. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with that anyway, but like, these are the kinds of questions that, now people are starting to be able to ask. And I'm very thankful for guys like you who have these, these different channels where these things are being discussed. Ancient Aliens was sort of my first foray into that. Joe Rogan also is doing some great work, just in terms of making this stuff very widely available. So now that a lot of more people are looking into it and thinking about it, I think we're on a good path. However, it's still a little bit alarming in some ways, in that many of the viewers or listeners are just gonna take whatever the guy says. Like, let's say it's Joe Rogan. You maybe everything that's on Joe Rogan you believe. Well, that's kind of stupid, because he has a whole bunch of different people with different opinions. They can't all be right, because some of them
they
are
contradict each other at times.
Yeah, but I guess what my point is that it's good to have these conversations opened up, but we all have to do our homework, and it's all on us to kind of check those facts.
Yeah, and I think the best research, and this is usually how we try to do it, like, so we do a bunch on like Billy the Kid. Well, we read a lot of what's called like the mainstream, which is what I tend to go to. Like, I think he was killed in Fort Sumner. I think there's too much that points that way, but we've also looked at the Brushy Bill stuff, and so I always try to look at both sides, and then it's kind of
Yeah,
Occam's razor, like which one's usually the simple answer is the truth.
right.
But yeah, like you said,
Well,
you just
yeah.
got.
So let's take that approach to
Mhm.
the UFO phenomenon, especially in terms of this idea of, if there were UFOs in the Bible, what's simpler? What's a simpler explanation? There are people kind of like us, but slightly different, who happen to live on another planet, kind of like ours, but slightly different, and happen to have machines that can fly in between those planets, kind of like ours, but slightly different. Or there's this other guy who's totally different, is completely impossible to understand, and he lives in a different universe even, and yet somehow is able to, like, make connections that way. Like, that that is way less believable of a story. I'm not saying it's not correct. It might be correct, but I guess in terms of, if you listen to what the writers are saying and you use your brain, and you actually look at other information that we know about, I think that that's where the value is. And so, I mean, decide for yourself. But yeah, like, there's just so much evidence, and really, kind of, I'm just trying to follow the evidence, and
Mhm.
that's really what this Fermi's paradox book is all about. Is It's really just looking at evidence, and not even really drawing conclusions that much, but just looking at the evidence.
Yeah, it seemed like it was just gathering of the evidence and like kind of letting the viewer, or not viewer, I'm saying that because they're on here, the reader
The reader, yeah,
take it and then be able to do their research and then come to their conclusions. But at least you've laid out where to find it. You got a lot of great annotations and stuff, and that way they can go and actually do it. Because I think a lot of times too, that's the problem with like YouTube, is a lot of time people don't put where they got the information from, and so
yeah,
then it's kind of like dead end. And so, I mean, I really
Absolutely.
appreciated that about your book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it's very important to list your sources, and as well as to list your thought process is really what I'm trying to do, especially in my UFOs in the Bible book. It's really about that thought process and that journey. When I started writing that book, I didn't even know what it was going to be about because I just started looking at stuff and writing down what I was seeing. And it was the first time I'd looked at any of that material. So I certainly didn't have any kind of preconceived idea about what I was going to find. But as I began to look at it, it was like, what? This, I can't believe this, but it just kept on getting stronger and stronger as I went. It's sort of what happened with the Fermi's Paradox book as well, is that I kind of turned my attention to some questions like, for example, is there water in space? Because that's important. Human life and animal life and all the life that we know on Earth is extremely dependent on water. There's this idea that there is no water in space, and space is just dead, and there's nothing out there, and you can't survive. Where did that idea come from? Well, I mean, for one thing, we have to realize that we haven't been in space very long. I mean, we've been in space for billions of years, but we've been like dead, like in terms of our perceptions. We have not been able to see anything. So it's only very recently where we have began to develop tools to actually look outside of our own planet, and kind of just see what's going on out there. However, I don't want to let the scientists off too easily because, as it turned out, some of these things that we were looking at, there's also evidence that we have known some of these things for quite a while, and that information has been buried or suppressed, or there have been fake news around it, or it's just been. Well, okay, the biggest example. So first, before I move off of the water thing, so 20 years ago, ask anybody, is there water in space? No, there's no water. I don't think so. However, it has now been proven scientifically, and this is not fringe at all, although nobody's stepping forward and making this really public, but it's all coming from scientific papers that are in mainstream scientific periodicals such as Nature, Science, the big ones, and as well as stuff like Scientific American, Discover. Nobody's really putting the puzzle pieces together. I mean, maybe some people are. I'm not aware. So when I kind of did it myself, I was shocked because it turns out in the solar system alone, which is just our little neighborhood in the universe, in the galaxy within the universe, there's 50 times more water in our solar system than there is on Earth. It's a far cry from, is there any water in space? Probably not. Yeah, there is. So why have we been led to believe that there isn't? Is kind of a big question. And why is nobody standing up and noticing this? Again, it's starting to change now. More of the news outlets are kind of picking up on things like exoplanets. I mean, there's always been public interest in kind of the weird stuff about science. Black holes, supernovas, all that kind of stuff.
Planet X.
But yeah, exactly. And like, where do they come from if they are out there? And we don't know that yet, but we do know that there's water out there, and there's lots of planets that are very capable of sustaining life. And that's even if we're just talking about life as we know it. Never mind about other kinds of life, like silicon-based life, which is also entirely feasible. To me, it's odd that there is a ton of information. Most of the evidence that I have seen, have looked at, is really pointing me towards that conclusion that there's definitely, in terms of probability, the probability is definite on the side of there is life out there. It's not to really say anything about the intelligence of that life necessarily, but there has to be some kind of biological life. Just with so the water thing is one thing. I look at a whole bunch of other factors in the book. One thing that's very interesting, though, if you go back to the Mars mission from 1974 that NASA launched, and they sent a probe. It's an unmanned mission, but NASA sent a unit similar to the lunar lander. This is 5 years after the moon landing, and they decided that they wanted to check out Mars. So they sent a ship up there. It was able to land on Mars, take a bunch of samples, do some experiments on the soil, and then come back home and bring some of those samples back home. On that trip in 1974, there were 3 experiments designed by NASA's top engineers that were supposed to answer the question of, is there biological, well, first of all, is there any traces of biochemistry even? So it's not necessarily saying is anything alive, but was there ever anything alive on Mars? So actually one of the experiments was basically that, and the other 2 were essentially, is there actual microbial life currently living in Mars? All 3 of those experiments came back with a yes. So in 1974, NASA found life on Mars. They published it. They didn't. I'm not sure if it made it to like a peer-reviewed paper. I think it got stopped before that, because basically, when the results came in, the people who designed the experiments were like, "Whoa, man! Like, this is really cool," and their bosses were like, "We're not going to talk about that." So that information got squelched for, what is this? That was like 30, 35, 40 years ago. And only now is that information getting out, although there's not been a press release or anything like that, but they're quietly, basically, you can find the information. So I don't know if it was leaked or if, like, I don't know how that is out there now, but it is out there. And I believe that NASA is, I'll just speculate a little bit, because you've got guys like Elon Musk, who is saying that he's going to have a manned base on Mars within the next 10 years. I believe he could do it. He got the heavy, what's his rocket called? SpaceX Heavy.
SpaceX, Starlink, the Boring Company.
Yeah. He's got all of this cool stuff, right? He did like his lander, his heavy lift rocket, which is able to go up into orbit and come back down and land again.
Exactly, like, where it's
insane.
Yeah.
How does he do this stuff? And he did it in like a fraction of the time that NASA would have done it. I mean, NASA could have done that 50 years ago. They didn't. Musk comes on the scene and he's able to do in years what the mainstream companies are doing in decades. So will he have a colony on Mars in the next 10 years? If I was a betting man, I would put my money on it. Even if he doesn't, we're going to be going there, or like at least for short-term, scientific trips. So basically the cat's going to be out of the bag in terms of NASA being able to hide anything about Mars. There's a lot of weird stuff that we're seeing in terms of pictures from Mars rovers. Some of them are pretty speculative. There's a couple that I've seen where it's like, that is weird. Like, you really got to wonder. But, a lot of people are saying that there's already like ruins or essentially ancient cities and stuff like that on Mars. The evidence that I've seen, to me, is not quite strong enough to suggest. Like, I'm not going to say, yeah, that's an alien city, but a lot of it is weird enough that you kind of want to take another look. So I'm hoping that that some of these upcoming Mars missions will reveal a lot more information on some of those questions, as well as taking another look at these experiments that they did in 1974. Let's redo those experiments and see if we can replicate the results that those guys got.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to me because I remember as a kid there was one book I found at my school, and then I forget, I ended up getting it like as an award or something, but it was about Mars, and at the end it was like talking about going to Mars, but it just seemed, as a kid, especially when there's not too much space, we're not going to the moon, seemed like such a far off thing that we probably wouldn't see it now. Like you said, Elon Musk is there, and it definitely seems like we'll get there quickly. Um, Definitely in my lifetime, if not my daughter's lifetime, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's kind of weird people don't think there was life on there because I mean, it's pretty well known that Mars was very Earth-like at one point, much like Venus, and then it just lost its atmosphere. So it's like, well, it could have supported, and honestly, that might have even been where life on Earth started. Like maybe a meteor hit that and brought it to Earth.
Yeah, well, that's a really good comment. So there have been meteors discovered on Earth, or like even documented ones that we actually watched, fall and make a small crater here. Some of those meteorites have been studied scientifically and analyzed, and we take them apart. We do run a bunch of samples and stuff like that. And I'm not entirely sure exactly how they do this, but the scientific community is aware, and it's, again, this is not fringe science. This is mainstream science, that some of these asteroids were somehow basically ejected from Mars and now landed here. So some of these chunks of rock are actual Mars rocks. So most likely what happens is a large meteor smashes into Mars, shit goes flying everywhere. Some of that shit ends up here. So, I mean, that's not speculative. That's 100% fact. Where it gets a little bit speculative is that inside some of those meteors, there have been discovered what appears to be, and this is a little bit controversial, but it appears to be biological material. So, like simple stuff. Like, I'm not saying a fossil necessarily, but like something that is the chemistry is a biochemistry. So it's not conclusive, but it does tell us that for sure it's possible for stuff to get from Mars to here, and it's feasible for some of that stuff to contain the traces of life, or at least the elements of life. Now, this is really critically important because when you go back to the question of the origin of life, like before any of the whole evolutionary stuff happens, there has to be something to evolve. And no one has yet come up with any kind of a theory that is even remotely plausible. There's been lots of theories proposed, whether it's God made them, or they came from Venus, or they somehow miraculously formed in some kind of hot swamp. But none of those really hold water. And so don't quote me on this, but I'm going to refer to a guy named Francis Crick. Francis Crick is one of the two people who basically invented DNA. Of course, he didn't invent it, and he didn't even discover it. But what they did was Crick and Watson wrote the book on DNA. Like, they were the first people to really dig into what DNA is, how it works, describe it and analyze it. And basically everything we know about DNA comes from those guys' discoveries. So Crick is not some flake who doesn't know what he's talking about. He is I would say probably like one of the ultimate experts on biology and biochemistry. So it's interesting that what he said was he determined that it was basically impossible for any of the suggested mechanisms for abiogenesis, which is basically the start of life from nothing. And his personal belief was that life came already living in living form, came from somewhere else. It did not start on Earth. Whether that was from Mars or somewhere farther afield, he did not speculate on. I mean, he didn't have access to that kind of data. But now we do, and I talk a lot about that, some of that data in my Fermi book. So if you read that book, you will know more about where life came from than Crick did. But I think you will probably agree with his conclusion that it didn't start here.
Yeah, and it's definitely started because I feel like I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson even talk about like life starting not from Earth and coming here.
Yeah.
So it seems like some of these bigger minds or like more mainstream minds are like kind of talking about that openly now. So it's definitely a change
For
in
sure,
the times.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about it, as does Michio Kaku. So these are, smart guys who know a lot of stuff, and they are not talking about this like it's ridiculous at all. They're not saying it's they believe it necessarily, but they're approaching it as a feasible, yeah, very possible, one of the ways that it could happen. But the weird thing is, I'm not really hearing them talk about any other ways that it might happen. They're talking about it as if it may or may not be true, but it's also the only theory that they're talking about. So that's interesting. I mean, it is what it is. I don't want to put too much on that.
Right. I mean, obviously that was such a long time ago. There's a pretty good possibility we may never know like how that happened. Like that definitely might be one of those things that, and hey, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we need those like unanswerable questions to keep like the motivation to keep learning and stuff. I do know there's a pretty interesting like documentary, and Michio Kaku's in there as well as like Stephen Hawking. I think it's like Phil Curry or Jack Horner, one of the two. But it's kind of based off of this book Expedition, where they go to an alien planet, and so they come together and kind of describe what alien life would be like. And so,
yeah.
yeah, I found that fascinating. I know we've talked about it on the channel, but it's a pretty fun one. Definitely the CGI is outdated by now, but
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
wasn't that
it's interesting to think about different ways what things could be like, right? I mean, I'm a big fan of science fiction as well, and some of the earlier books of sci-fi that I read were things were very different. Um, like there wasn't a bipedal humanoid in sight, and that's also a possibility. Is that maybe we're the weird ones, and would we even recognize intelligent life if we saw it? Well, no, we wouldn't, because there's intelligent life on Earth, and we don't recognize that either.
Mhm. And that's kind of like the interesting thing is we almost have like a what's the complex name? But where we think we're like the end all be all. And
Yeah.
there's been some recent studies because I mean back in the day dinosaurs were looked at really kind of stupid and that's why they went extinct. But there was a recent study on like the brain case of Tyrannosaurus where it was probably as intelligent, in at least by the study, as like
Mhm.
some of the great apes, so baboons and gorillas, and may even have had their own cultures.
Right. Well, I mean, it wasn't very long ago that everyone thought apes were stupid. Everyone thought dogs were stupid. I mean, I still kind of think dogs are stupid, but there's plenty of other people around who will disagree with me, and they have good reason to. And there's plenty of evidence that dogs are really smart. Where was I going with this? Okay. It wasn't very long ago that everybody, I'm going to use my air quotes, everybody, the powers that be, thought that African American people were stupid. So obviously those guys were fucking wrong. And so they were probably wrong about all these other things too. It's the same question, right?
Yeah, I mean, not that long ago, none of us could have voted because they didn't think we were smart enough to actually know. I mean, 200 years ago, but still, like, none of us, because they just thought, unless you were in the actual, like, royalty, you wouldn't have known any of the candidates
That's
and
right.
couldn't
The
have
whole
actually
class
chosen.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Only the lords could make decisions. If you
Mhm.
happen to, if you happened to inherit some land from your grandpa, then you must be smart. The rest of us are just too stupid to do anything.
Well, and,
Yeah,
and
it's really weird.
yeah, intelligence was something I made a note of because you were talking about like radio as a measure of intelligence, but what about all the people that came before radio? Were they
Yeah.
not?
Well, exactly. Um, like that's the thing is like there's this nice little idea that everything that we know now is important, and everything that anybody else ever knew before is not important. And yet they were able to survive with that information, and possibly they had better quality of life than we do now. I don't know. How do we measure happiness? And there's all kinds of uh, people who have studied that question and tried to write books about it, and we still don't know. We still don't really know what it is that makes people happy, and that's only one measure, like intelligence, happiness. Sometimes they are in direct conflict with each other. Um, Throw money in there, throw power in there. Now you've got all kinds of weird conflicts. Um, so what's better? Is it here's the thing. If you look at how an octopus lives in the ocean, you will see that they have very low social, not, well, how do I say this? They tend to be quite, what's the word where you just like to be out by yourself? They're
Like a
loners
loner.
mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so when you look at octopuses in the wild, uh, they are social creatures, but 99% of the time they like to be by themselves. Now, maybe they're doing that on purpose. Maybe they have learned a lesson that when they get into groups and they start to form societies, it doesn't make their life any better. Maybe they have already learned that putting a whole bunch of intelligent beings in one spot will only lead to war and destruction and pain. Like, who knows? Have they ever have octopuses had a society? Have octopuses had advanced civilization? Has their civilization been more advanced in some regards than our own? We have no idea. Like, it's easy to assume that these are stupid questions and the answer is no, but there is no answer and there's no evidence. So a yes might be just as um, reasonable of a result as a no.
Yeah, octopuses are interesting. I mean, obviously they have a lot of intelligence. There's another documentary, The Future is Wild. Granted, they did have a couple cephalopod experts on there, so it might make sense, but they said like the next like hyper intelligent being was probably going to be from the cephalopod family. And so I mean that's definitely interesting because again it goes back to like us thinking that you have to look like a human when you
Mhm.
really don't have to.
Well, put it this way: if we did not have steel and we did not rely so much on electricity, and it was down to us and the octopuses, and all we had was a giant catapult, and the idea was, let's see who gets to Mars first. I bet the octopuses would win. I bet the octopuses would be able to colonize Mars, basically with very limited technology and tool sets, because they can probably survive in space better than we can, and their body forms are certainly more suited to a zero gravity, or the types of things like pressure or low pressure or high pressure, and the pressure gradations and changes in gravity and pressure, as well as heat. They're probably better suited than we are, because we don't stand a chance. We can't survive 10 seconds out in space. I don't think we've ever tried it with an octopus. I'm not recommending that we do, but it's a question. Like, just look at how their bodies work. They don't have to stand on a surface to move. They're very agile, and they're able to use principles of physics that work just as well in zero gravitation, because they're already used to the fluid dynamics of their current watery environment.
Yeah, I mean, and then they can just like squeeze into like the teeniest, tiniest holes that there's just like, how did they do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, maybe they have a mason jar and they can get to Mars that way. Well, good luck with us. Right?
Yeah. Before we get to the title of your book, there was one note because you talk about the age of some of the water on Earth.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk about like how kind of really old it is?
Sure. So, okay. So, firstly, the water on Earth was not here at the beginning of the Earth's life cycle. So, when Earth was formed, there was no water here. The reason we know that is that it was really hot. Like, before the Earth was a bunch of melted shit. So, like lava, basically. And it still is. The Earth is 99% lava. It just happens to have cooled down enough that the outside surface is basically solid, but it isn't even really solid, because we still have plate tectonics and earthquakes and all that fun stuff. So the Earth is still basically just a slowly cooling ball of magma and floating around in space. And if you had tried to pour water on it, it would have evaporated, because it was just too dang hot. And once it evaporated, it would have just blown off, because there was no atmosphere either. So essentially, like, let's say you took a giant spaceship full of water. Like, go ahead. Are you going to say something?
Yeah, you might lose me, because I think my phone is about to update itself.
Oh, great. Yeah, you're kind of breaking up a little bit. If you were to take a giant tanker full of water right now and go dump it on Mars, it's not going to stick. Even though it's cool enough, so it's that one of the problems is solved. But there's still the problem of the atmosphere. There's very little atmosphere on Mars. There is atmosphere on Mars, though. In fact, the Mars rover has video images that you can go look at on the NASA website that shows a cloud, like a, what do you call it? Like dust, the
Like a
swirling
dust
dust
devil?
thing. Dust devil, yeah. So and you can't have that without atmosphere. So, and wind. So there's atmosphere and wind on Mars, but you need a substantial amount of atmosphere to block the solar rays and stuff like that, in order for like a really luscious kind of atmosphere to arrive on a planet. So maybe I would say that it's probably safe to say that Mars is currently developing an atmosphere, and probably will have water if we wait long enough and we go back and check. Well, there is already water on Mars, but that's beside the point.
Yeah, the caps and
Uh,
stuff.
yeah. But anyway, so at the beginning of the Earth's history, we're talking about 2.5 billion years ago. It was really hot. There was no water here. As the Earth gradually cooled down, um, we gradually, well, we kept on. We're always being bombarded by these asteroids and comets. Comets are made out of a lot of water. Most comets are actually mostly water. And every asteroid that we have been able to study has at least trace amounts of water. So all of these objects that are bombarding us, it's very similar to the moon. If you look at the moon and it's covered with craters, well, that's the reason is because the rocks are smashing into it all the time, and they are here too. We just don't notice most of them because they're landing in the forest or they're landing in the ocean, and they either don't leave a trace in the ocean or they're in the forest and you don't notice them. After many millions of years of all these things smashing into us, eventually the water from these objects began to accumulate into oceans. Now, of course, when that started happening, the oceans were very small. Um, Again, I don't know, like in terms, nobody's really done the math on like exactly what that looked like. There is one book that I read where he shows sort of his idea of what the Earth looked like when the ocean was maybe 5 or 10% of the size that it is now, which is interesting because it's vastly different. It's a very different Earth. And that absolutely did look like maybe not exactly like his recreation, but absolutely there was a time on Earth when there was an ocean that is 5% of the time of the size it is now, because we started out with zero, and we now are at what 80% or whatever. 80%
Yeah.
of the Earth is covered with water, so we had to go through every single number. There was, unless it happened in really large chunks, maybe we missed some numbers. Maybe we're going up by 10% or 20, and then 20 and 30. In which case, then you got to wonder, what would it look like for a huge object that big to crash into Earth? Well, that's going to be a massive explosion when it hits, even if it's made out of ice, even if it's made out of liquid water, even if it was ice and it melted on the way in, uh, that amount of water smashing onto an object is going to do significant damage. So it's completely insane to not think about these kinds of effects in terms of, we know where we're kind of what we started out, and we know where we're at now, and we know that there was all this long history. Well, we actually do also have evidence in the fossil record of these extreme extinction event kind of things. They usually call them an extinction event, but really it's not just a, hey, today everyone's going extinct. No, it's something happened, and whatever that was very large and catastrophic, and because of that, it sets off a chain of events, and a whole bunch of species die. There's one in the fossil record. There's one, I can't
And the
remember which one.
Triassic. Yeah, the Triassic were like
Triassic,
95% of life went extinct.
yeah, yeah, like crazy. And so, we still don't really know exactly why that happened. I mean, there's a lot of different things that could do that. In fact, um, you know, within the next 24 hours, it's entirely possible and scientifically feasible, and in fact, scientifically probable, based on the length of time since the last one happened and the frequency of these events, that we would that everyone on Earth would die from a solar flare, everyone on Earth would die from a comet, large enough comet or meteor strike. Everyone on Earth would die from a large enough volcano. This has happened many times in the past, where a volcano is able to basically obliterate the oxygen levels, and we'd all choke to death. So, I mean, we are in such a fragile state. But we do know that not one of those events has ever resulted in 100% annihilation of life on Earth, because we're still here. But wait, maybe that's not even true, because if you consider this panspermia thesis, which is I guess we didn't say it before, but that's the word that they use when we're talking about life coming from other planets. Crick believes in it. Michio Kaku and those other guys are talking about it like it's feasible, highly feasible. So even when you consider that there's these extinction events, then we still have life coming to Earth from elsewhere. So it is actually possible that there have been times when there was nothing left on Earth. So yeah, truly an extinction level event on 100% extinction. And these are things that it's highly likely, in fact, because it's more likely for even a cosmic flare or solar flare. We're already 200 years overdue for a solar flare the size that will easily knock out the entire electrical grid. That's not even a big solar flare. The big solar flares will destroy all life on the planet, and they happen cyclically. So yeah, like, I mean, it's kind of insane to think that we've been here this whole time and never having had to restart.
Well, and as humans, we've been around for such a little amount of time. I always remembered, like, one of the things in school, you'd go out to the football field and humans would have been around just on the opposite side of that 1 yard line for just like a hair fraction.
Yeah.
But you're talking about like water and a big object causing that, perhaps. But I mean, a lot of the accepted thesis of like how the moon was created was a giant impact on Earth that shot debris out, and then it formed the moon.
Yeah, that's a little bit debated in terms of, like, I mean, I don't say you're incorrect to call it an accepted thesis, but it's not the only accepted thesis. But yeah, it is quite possible that the moon and the Earth and possibly some other body that has now like rocketed off somewhere, deflected away. Like, we don't really know what happened or what the result is, other than that we know that we're here and the moon is there. Was Mars also involved? I don't know. This is where you can get into speculation about, Planet X and Nibiru and stuff like that. We also do have the asteroid belt, which is this massive field of rubble located in between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. So it's farther out from the sun than Mars, and it's not quite as far as Jupiter. But it's this huge, like, enormous belt of rubble, and it circles the entire sun. So, I mean, even if it was like just think about how large a space that is, right? So I don't know if anyone has calculated the size of how much, like, if that was all consolidated into one object, how big would that planet be, right? And somebody has to have done the math on that. It's not something I have at my fingertips. But basically, that's probably what happened, is that, as the solar system is forming, all of, like, at one point, the entire solar system was just a bunch of stuff like that, like just rubble. But it all coagulates. That's how solar systems work. That's how planets form. That's how our planet formed. So it's I don't even think that I can use the word feasible here. I think I would say definite, that it's definite that there was once a planet there. That's just how the physics works in that kind of situation, and it's really all just about gravity. That certainly is interesting. And then now jump back to the fact we were talking about earlier about water in that asteroid belt. All of those objects have water in them. There's like that. The asteroid belt is one of the most watery places in the solar system. So what did that planet that was there look like before it got destroyed? Well, it had oceans. It had to have. If there's that much water there now, and there's that much there, that much rock there, well, you take all the rock, you stick it together, and then you wrap the water around it, because that's how gravity works. So that would have had a massive ocean, probably covering the entire surface, and probably quite deep. So it would have been like a Kevin Costner Waterworld type of situation.
Oh yeah, Waterworld. I forgot about that movie. Yeah, and what is it? Titan? Titan has water on it too, a pretty good size.
Titan does, and
Deep
Cephalus
oceans.
does. There's at least 9 of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn where we have confirmed water. That's confirmed, not suspected. And there's a good many more of them where there probably is, but we haven't confirmed it yet.
Yeah, and then you go to further out in space. Isn't there? I think there's a secondary belt around between like Neptune and Pluto, or just past Pluto. There's another asteroid belt, which was again probably another collision out there.
Well, there's a thing called the Oort cloud, and it's so far away that I can't even tell you. I can't even talk about it because I don't understand those kind of distances. But it's past like all the planets, but it's still part of the solar system because it's still orbiting around our sun. And you can even go out past that, and it's still technically you're in the solar system because it has to do with the gravity well of the star that we're around. And yeah, this Oort cloud is like, we talked about how big the asteroids belt has to be because of just how far away it is, and the fact that it goes around the sun. Okay, it goes around the sun in 2 dimensions. Basically, like the solar system is basically a disk. Like it's not a big sphere with stuff flying around all over. It's a disk with all the planets going around like a record player. And so the weird thing about the Oort cloud is it's a sphere. So this is mind-boggling, just the size of this thing. And it's not just 2-dimensional, it's 3-dimensional. And it's essentially like, I guess, I don't know if it's even accurate to call it a dust cloud or like how big these fragments are, because I mean, we're able to detect them from here, and it's like way the hell out there. So I don't know, but the fact that there's stuff there that we can detect, and it's that far away, and it's 3-dimensional. It blows my mind. I don't really know what to think about that. Another question is, why is it 3-dimensional? Why hasn't it flattened out into a disk like everything else? That's weird. So that is possibly one way to answer that, is because it hasn't had time. So that, again, that's interesting. So if it's new, relatively new in terms of cosmic terms, how did it get there? Did somebody put it there? Like, what the hell's going on? It's weird.
Space is one of those mysteries that I always find so fascinating, just because, I mean, it's so big. Like, obviously, I mean, it's supposed to be infinite? Who knows if it actually is? Like, we don't even know, like, the Big Bang. It might have just been like the universe coming back together now and then popping back out.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah.
Well, and now people are talking about white holes, which is interesting because that was an idea that I had. about 20 years ago. And I'm not saying that I was the first person to have the idea, but I didn't know about the idea when I had it. But basically, if there's a black hole that's sucking everything in, well, things like look at the conservation of momentum from physics point of view. If everything is getting sucked in, it doesn't make sense to just say that it compacts to an infinite density. No, it's going to get sucked in, and it's going to keep going past each other. But the issue is because of the density and of mass, all the laws of physics break down. So that is really ultimately the end of the universe. So that the universe doesn't have an end. The universe has a whole lot of different ends, and they are all these black holes. There's a lot of black holes, like millions of black holes. And so whenever these black holes appear, they're getting sucked in, and essentially the universe stops. But then it keeps going in a new universe. So that is a white hole, and that is also the Big Bang. So the Big Bang is just one of these millions of white holes that are currently existing. Everywhere there's a black hole, there's also at least one white hole.
Yeah, and what did you think of how Interstellar depicted black holes?
Well, I mean, you can't really go through it because you're depending on your body as a physical object to survive, which is not going to happen. However, they also kind of did sort of a spiritual, mystical, or whatever, some kind of take on it, which if you look at it from that perspective, maybe it makes more sense. But then again, does it make sense for a spirit to have a location? I don't know. Maybe it does. I mean, if you are like a ghost, like there's people who investigate ghosts and stuff. Well, those seem to be a spirit that has a physical location. So it might not have a physical manifestation, but it seems to be at least pretending to be limited to a location, temporally and spatially. So I don't know. Maybe Interstellar's legit. Maybe it's feasible.
One more off-topic question: Younger Dryas and interstellar events connection?
I mean, were there interstellar events during the Younger Dryas period? Of course there were. There's always interstellar events. Were there comets and asteroids smashing into Earth? Of course, just like there always is. Were there sunspots? Yes. Were there solar flares? Of course. Were there biological life forms, or at least the building blocks of those life forms, falling to Earth during the Younger Dryas event? Probably. I mean, if that's a thing, that's even a reasonable, feasible things like Crick believes it is, then there's no reason to think that would have stopped happening during the Younger Dryas event. I think the biggest thing that's obvious about the Younger Dryas period is the ocean level rise. And I mean, how is this still controversial? Like, duh. Like, if a whole bunch of ice melts, the water is going to go up. So, Graham Hancock is still banging his head against the walls of academia. Academia is being so stupid about it. Like, okay, now you just like to argue. Like, there's no sense here. So, so here's what I think. One of the main reasons that we don't know very much about a long time ago, like basically, we know almost nothing about any of Earth's civilization prior to 10,000 years ago, or around. I'm rounding for the Younger Dryas period. The reason for that is because they're all underwater, So if you look at where are 90% of cities located today,
On the
I
coast.
don't know where you guys live.
Oh, we
Yeah,
Colorado, high up in the mountains.
Okay, so there's always going to be guys up in the mountains, but most of the people are in LA and New York and New Orleans and all of those other coastal cities that are always at the mouth of a river. Mouth of the river is always the best place to live in terms of like survival if you're a hunter gatherer, especially. Uh, it's not so great of a place to live for survival if you're concerned about hurricanes and floods and tsunamis. But in terms of just the accessibility of food, that's where all the food's at. And if you're relying on spear fishing and fishing in general and hunting, you've got tons of options. What happens if I mean, there's a lot of talk now about global warming, and the sea level rise is part of that, but it's not really getting a lot of publicity, even though it's really actually the kind of the most important part of it, because if the polar caps ice caps continue to melt at the rate that they're melting, huge swaths of land are going to be underwater. New York is going to get hit hard, but LA is going to be way worse off because it's really flat there. And so pretty much all of LA will be underwater. Uh, and that's only with with an ocean level rise of a couple of meters. In the Younger Dryas period, and this is not speculated either. This is absolutely documented in science by many different means. During that period, the ocean level rose by 400 feet. So you're still safe in Colorado, but I'm not sure if I'm safe where I am. And I know that that 90% of the cities in the world where probably 99% of the populations are, they're going to be moving and they're going to be forced out of their homes. And so what are they going to do? Well, this all happened very quickly in the Younger Dryas period. There was this massive surge in ocean levels, and it happened over the course of a couple of generations. So, but that's the 400 feet. So if you look at if you divide that by say on a yearly basis, there was noticeable ocean level rise, uh, like noticeable. Like, hey, last year the ocean didn't come up here. The beach is is weird. Like, what's going on? So people were noticing it, and they were able to get out. They were able to move. They weren't just swallowed up like a tidal wave and killed. But they packed up their stuff and they headed for higher ground. What they didn't do is disassemble their ancient pyramids and temples and move those to higher ground. Luckily, there was already some of those already on higher ground, such as at Göbekli Tepe. But if you look in the Mediterranean Sea, the Egyptians did not pack up their cities and move them inland. In some cases they did, but they already had a bunch of stuff that was really old, not 2,000 years old, but it was already old at the time of the Younger Dryas period, and yet underneath the Mediterranean Sea right now, we've already discovered 200 cities under the ocean in the Mediterranean Sea. So, obviously, that's the place to look. But nobody that I know of is looking at some of the huge areas in the world right now that are underwater. And one of the biggest areas is the area in between England and France to Germany, so that whole area where the English Strait and the North Sea are right now, that was all dry land. There was no such thing as the English Strait. or the English Channel. And there's plenty of rivers that go down there. So all of those rivers that are currently big centers in Europe, like the Rhine and the Thames, like where London is, you got to move downstream 400 feet vertical, which is going to take you miles and miles out into the ocean. In Indonesia, you have an even more substantial change, whereas there was like an area the size of like a continent size. Like, I'm guessing here, but maybe about the size of China, which is huge, or like almost as size as Australia. That all that much land that is currently under the ocean and surrounds all of these island nations in Indonesia, the Philippines, and all of this whole South Asian area. That was all once land and jungle or farmland, and we have no way of looking at that. Like, how would you even look for stuff there? It's such a huge amount, such a huge, area. Where do you even start? Well, you should start by following the rivers, and here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes on the continental shelf, you can still see where the ancient rivers used to flow when it was land, because a lot of the times there are these basically canyons, like almost like the Grand Canyon. And there's a couple of spots off the coast of California where there's this huge canyon that you can actually see it on Google Earth. And it's very obvious that it's just the extension of the river that currently still runs into it. Those are the places we need to be looking. We need to be following that path, cross-referencing it where the depth gets to 400 feet. Bam, that's where your city would have been. Look on both sides of that chasm.
Yeah, and you talk about rising waters. I remember I was watching a video by Atun Shea, and he was said that because he lives in New Orleans, and he's like, yeah, it'll be underwater in my lifetime. And so, like, people already are like, yep, it's going to be gone. So it's not like these things happen, like, I mean, sometimes they happen super fast, but usually people are smart enough, hopefully, to, like, move out. But I know, like, if you look at some other interesting places, it's like the Eye of the Sahara and stuff, where it's super old too. And I know Bright Insight has talked about it. At least that's where I learned.
I love that stuff. Yeah. Jimmy's doing some amazing stuff that nobody else was picking up on, and he was ridiculed for it. Even by some of the fringe guys were, well, maybe not ridiculing, but disagreeing with him. But you know what? He is onto something there. Highly recommend all your viewers check out the Bright Insight channel, and that's amazing. That stuff is amazing. And Jimmy, if you're listening to this, get a hold of me, because I want to make a book with you, man.
Yeah, and get a hold of us, because I'd love to talk to you. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do enjoy his videos. I forget how long it was I found him, and just like the video quality now is like so much better. And I enjoy saying that, because it just means he's getting more and more success doing it, and it helps reach more and more people. Now that we've like successfully gotten super far off track, I'll try to reel it back in. So the title of your book is the Fermi's Paradox is Bullshit. Now, for viewers that possibly don't know what Fermi's Paradox is, do you want to explain that to them?
I'll try to do it very briefly, because it's kind of a long and boring explanation, to be honest. But essentially, so there's this idea around that. So first of all, it goes to Enrico Fermi, who was a physicist during the Second World War, and he was one of the guys who was involved in developing nuclear technology. This is the same technology that eventually turned into the atom bomb. Not necessarily a good result, but these were very smart people doing a lot of very cutting edge science. And so that's who Enrico Fermi is. What does that have to do with the Fermi paradox? Well, actually, almost nothing, because what happened was there is a report that is not a direct quote, but maybe, maybe it's credible. This happened in 1950. So, keep in mind Roswell happened in 47. So it's UFOs and flying saucers were kind of in the public eye, and lots of people were talking about them. But were physicists talking about them? Yeah, probably. I mean, for sure. Um, so apparently, Fermi was having lunch with some of his colleagues, and he said, well, where is everybody? Really, like the aliens? Like, how come we're not seeing them? And so, ostensibly, this is a paradox because uh, the other side of the question is, well, there's all of this data that suggests that there should technically or probabilistically there should be intelligent life out there. This is called the Drake equation. So the Drake equation basically goes, there's the sun that we're around is one of billions of stars in our galaxy, the Milky Way. The galaxy, the Milky Way, is one out of billions of galaxies in the universe, and so probabilistically, there's got to be other planets out there where we could survive. Well, we've proved that now because we've found a ton of exoplanets, and we talk about that in the book. But basically, so this whole idea was the Drake equation was put out by a guy named Drake. I can't remember his first name. And so the theory of the Fermi paradox is that Fermi was thinking about the Drake equation and was like, and responded by saying, well, yeah, but where is everybody? Well, the problem with this is the Drake equation didn't happen. Drake did not put this equation together until at least 10 or possibly 20 years after Fermi was dead. So Fermi did not respond to the Drake equation. Also, there's no indication that Fermi actually ever said anything remotely like that. There's no actual records of it. It's just supposedly. It's hearsay. It's all rumor. So, but the other problem with it is that the question of where is everybody, the answer is, duh, they're right here. So the only way that you can possibly say there's no evidence of alien life is to ignore all the evidence that is part of the ufology phenomenon, of which there's thousands of cases. So my other book, Before Roswell, looks at all the well-documented cases, starting as far back as we can go, like where there have been human records, and going through ancient times, through the mythologies that we've inherited. But really, you got to remember, most of these myths are not simply like the word myth is even messed up, because when we think of myth, we think of mostly the Greek and Roman myths, and the Greek and Roman myths are pure fiction. Like, obviously, like they are there to entertain. But before the Greeks, most of the mythology was not viewed as fiction. It was viewed as sort of a kind of a combination of religion and math and science and history. So reading these documents as a historical document and as eyewitness testimony, you have a very different perspective as reading them as if they were a Roman myth, because they're not Roman myths. Our ancient ancestors were not just trying to sit around tell ghost stories to be entertaining. They may have been sitting around a fire, but they were doing so in order to pass on the indigenous knowledge that they had received from their ancestors. And for the most part, those stories were based on fact. Now, maybe certainly they got things wrong, just as we would if we were telling any story. Well, hell, read any newspaper, they've got something wrong. So but there's this idea that this information has been passed through our history, and it's never not been there. There has never been a period in human history where there aren't people seeing UFOs and describing them. And when they describe them, they're always telling the same types of descriptions. So there's a remarkable similarity within this phenomenon that spans thousands of years. Like I'm gonna say probably I'll be conservative and say 10,000 years. So we have stories that we can date pretty respectably for a 10,000 year period, and they're all saying that they saw something come from the sky. It looked like there's a small variance in terms of what type, like what shape and size and color they are, but it's enough so that it's kind of like, if you had, let's say you'd never seen a car, and you had to rely on eyewitness testimonies from Europe about what cars look like. Well, you're going to get a sports car, you're going to get a truck, you're going to get a sedan, and these are the exact same types of variants that we're seeing in the stories of UFOs all throughout history. Sometimes they're round, sometimes they're cigar shaped, sometimes they're house sized, sometimes they're whale sized, but they're never continent sized, and they're rarely very small. Although in some of the more recent times, we're seeing more and more stories of these kind of very small craft, like almost like a drone, or like a lot of witnesses are seeing what they call an orb. But anyway, so we look at these patterns, and how these patterns are really persistent all throughout human history. So there is a lot of evidence, and we stopped looking at 1947 because after that, there's just too much to even comprehend. Like I'm not going to write a book about every UFO sighting ever.
Right.
That's impossible, right? So
multiple
we wanted to
volumes.
look at, yeah. So we just looked at the old ones because we felt like nobody really had done a comprehensive study on that. So that is before Roswell. So yeah, I guess to answer your question, if you are stubborn and you've already made up your mind that UFOs are fake, or that UFOs don't exist, or I mean, they obviously exist because this is happening. So either everyone's lying, really, or like, how do you explain that? How can you explain the non-existence of UFOs? If you go back to the Occam's razor principle, like you said earlier, it's a lot easier to say, well, there's something flying in the sky, than to say, well, there's some other explanation. There's nothing actually in the sky, but millions of people are saying that they are. How do you explain that? I don't understand that. So looking at the data that we have that is readily explainable, then to say, well, UFOs aren't real, therefore, that's the only way that you can make the statement, where is everybody? Because otherwise, they've been here for thousands of years.
Yeah, and you talk about like Fermi having this quote attributed to him, even though he didn't say it. And we see it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times it's people want so badly for something to be true or not that they attach something. And we've seen that with like people want so badly for Billy the Kid to survive that there's this guy named John Miller in Arizona who not once said he was Billy the Kid, but they were like, oh yeah, he totally said it, but there's no documentation of this. In fact, there's more documentation where he said, no, I'm not Billy the Kid.
Yeah.
But you also bring, that up in a different way about Neil Armstrong in your book, where people so badly perhaps want to believe that there's aliens, but they attribute this story where you kind of throw some perhaps doubt on it.
Right. I mean, it's kind of a common, almost a meme now that if you Google Neil Armstrong UFO, you're going to get a bunch of hits on supposedly this story that Neil Armstrong was in one of the moon orbiters, and he looked out and he was apparently followed by this large green UFO. That's a nice story, but it didn't happen, at least according to people who went and asked Neil Armstrong about it. So he might be lying. I mean, it's entirely possible, because we do have the state of affairs where you, especially back in Neil's day, where you would be ridiculed, you would possibly lose your career and any kind of credibility that you have. So basically, did Neil want to get blacklisted, or did he, or was somebody just making this up? We don't know. So really, that's all we can say is we don't know. I'm not going to say that the story, it didn't happen, because honestly, it kind of fits with the criteria. Again, if you look at the patterns, if there are flying objects that appear to be coming from space to Earth and floating around in our atmosphere, it would also make sense for them to be above our atmosphere, and probably in any other kind of close by areas. And so why wouldn't you expect them to be some near the moon, or orbiting the moon, or any of the other planets? For that matter, the same kind of logic kind of goes towards the ideas of moon bases and Mars bases, which again, I think a lot of people are really wanting there to be evidence for that. In my opinion, the evidence is pretty weak, although it is interesting. I'm not going to say, oh, it's not, that there's no way that's a moon base. And I think there's a lot of stories around it that I think need to be further followed up and require more investigation. And these are things that we could easily do, because we are sending probes. We have sent people to the moon. Oddly, as soon as we found anything interesting there, we stopped going. Why has NASA not sent another man to the moon for 50 years? What's the deal? And then likewise with Mars. As soon as we go to Mars, we find, oh, maybe there's life here. And then we don't go back. Really? That's the part that I find most unbelievable, is that a scientific community that is interested in discovery, and in fact, that's their prime reason for existing, they're going to find something that piques their interest and then not look at it again. Sorry, something doesn't add up here.
Right. Well, in your book too, you talk about, and pardon me if I get this wrong, because chicken scratch would be nice term for how I wrote today. But Musgrave, and the snake in space.
Yeah. Again, I have a little bit of doubt around the Musgrave story. Story. That's funny, because his name is Story. Franklin Story Musgrave is an astronaut who apparently claimed to see some kind of snake-like object. Now, again, there's a little bit of discrepancy in terms of the information that I was able to gather. If I had to make my decision on it, which I don't, I'm leaning towards believing that he actually did see something, and he said that he described it as some kind of like a snake. But I've seen a couple of different versions of how he described it. Sometimes it kind of seemed like maybe some rope or some cabling or something like that. And at other times it seems like something stranger. So the jury's out on that one in terms of my own opinion. But again, it's worth following up on. I'm not sure if Musgrave is still alive or if he's available for further comment on that. But yeah, and he's only one of several other astronauts as well. And there's all kinds of claims on the internet that so and so dozens of astronauts have seen this. Well, again, some of these are being stretched very thin, but I also don't want to write them off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up like the rope and stuff, and it kind of reminded me of the what's it, the Black Knight satellite, where there's
Yeah.
obviously the super famous one picture, but then there's some other pictures that don't get circulated as much, where it definitely looks like it could be a panel or something that came off, or a blanket or something.
I mean, the pictures that I've seen, it looked to me, it looked like rotation of the same object. And it did look like a three-dimensional, like it almost looks like Boba Fett's Slave One ship. That's kind of the impression I get. But again, where did these images come from? I don't, I have not seen enough evidence in terms of the full provenance of where these images have come from. Um, so I reserve judgment on that one again. But the other thing that's interesting about the Black Knight is that it seems to be tied back to some pretty ancient sightings. Like the Black Knight may or may not be the same object that was seen hundreds of years ago. So that's interesting. And I do believe that, when somebody decided to write down some strange description of something really weird that they saw in the sky 500 years ago, uh, what would what is the motivation for writing that down? I very strongly lean, especially on these old and historic sightings. I very strongly lean towards believing them. At one point it became more fashionable to have hoaxes and to make shit up, but that was certainly not fashionable um, farther back in time.
Yeah, perhaps you mean like, the surgeon's photo and stuff like that, where, you know, a big thing, and it turned out to be a toy submarine with a little wood carving.
Yeah.
But I want to give you a date, and I want you to tell me a little bit about it, because I'm sure once I say it, October 13th, 1917. Pretty big event, at least
1917.
by your
You're
book
gonna
you were
have to
talking.
refresh my memory.
So it was
Oh yeah,
the
this is
the
the
yeah,
in LA. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Okay, so
like
again, this is a really weird. I believe something happened. I mean, okay, there's no denying that something happened. Um, what was that thing? Well, apparently, someone in the military was. I mean, okay, so let's put this into perspective. So this was no, hold on, 1917.
the Virgin
It's not.
Mary.
Oh, the
Yeah,
Fatima thing.
yeah.
Okay, okay. So again, something happened, um, and there was like I think 10,000 people there. The reason there was 10,000 people there is because they had basically been invited because there was almost a prophecy where these some farm children had apparently been visited by the Virgin Mary, and she told them to tell everyone that what day she's coming back and where she's going to be. So these kids started, telling their local minister and stuff like that, and word got out, and it became quite an event. And yeah, so the city was like swarmed with tourists at whatever time it was, and I think it was around noon ish. Um, it was a cloudy day, and there was now something was blazing in the sky, and everyone apparently was looking at this thing and saw this bright object in the sky. Some people claimed that it was speaking to them, um, and the overall impression of everyone there was that they attributed it to being the Virgin Mary who had come to give them a message. It's not like everybody could hear an audible message, and it's not like everybody saw the exact same thing. And those that did see something, it's not like they saw like a woman in the sky. It's not. It was more like a bright light, and some people um, described it as like it's the sun, and like maybe the clouds thinned and the sun peeked through. Although many people were like, no, it's definitely not the sun. And so that's a really weird one. But I kind of like, to me, the thing about it is you get more into this is a religious event and less of a UFO event because it doesn't exactly fit the criteria for how UFO sightings usually are. It has some of the same features, but it's lacking in quite a few of the other things that you would expect to see from a UFO sighting. So, was there actually an object in the sky at Fatima? Nobody really knows. And if it was an object, was it a physical object? It doesn't sound like it. So it sounds to me more like an example of something else, which is interesting because, a few minutes ago we were talking about if UFOs are not a physical object or are not real, then what are they? And this particular instance seems to fall into the what are they category because in my opinion, I don't think that there was like a UFO, like a flying saucer type of scenario going on that day. But there was definitely something going on. I've never seen any indication that would lead me to believe that mass hallucinations are possible, unless there's also like mass drug dosing somehow. A lot of skeptics will point to things like that. Oh, it's mass hallucination. Well, is that a thing? Because if it is, show me where it's existed. This is the modern day equivalent to swamp gas. It's just pure horseshit. There's no such thing as swamp gas that looks like a flying object. And there's also no such thing as mass hallucinations. There is definitely such a thing as mass hysteria, but that's different. That's more of like, the
Salem.
idea of a thing. Yeah, it's like more of a meme in terms of where people catch an idea and that idea gets spread and catches on, and maybe it's a very, very bad idea. In fact, I mean, you could argue that everything going on in the world right now is mass hysteria. But it's not because people saw something, it's because people believe something.
Yeah, and you kind of briefly brought up like LA or SoCal,
Yeah.
which is like Battle LA, where they were
Yeah.
supposedly shooting at these balloons and couldn't hit them, which, given current events, we know we can at least hit a balloon.
Yeah, well, we've found that out recently. Yeah, it's the battle for LA is odd because this is where this one kind of falls in between the cracks of hysteria and something real. Because if well, I mean, think about this: if you are in a battle formation, kind of battle readiness, right? That's the state of a high alertness, and you are prepared for a Japanese invasion of California. Then it isn't going to take much to set off a chain of events. So if one soldier on a beach in LA thought he saw something and shot at it, then that could easily be enough to start this whole thing, which eventually became known as the Battle of LA, where thousands of rounds of ammunition were spent that night. And the city went on lockdown. There was air raid sirens. Everybody it was the whole blackout thing, much like you'd see in an old World War II movie about the bombing of Berlin or London. It was very similar to that. But there may or may not have ever been any kind of flying object. Like, we just don't know. And I believe that information is out there, but is still classified. So it'll probably be declassified at some point, and we'll probably get a better answer on that particular instance. But for now, all we can do is guess.
I mean, what do you think would be declassified first, it or the JFK papers?
So since you bring up JFK, I want to mention a book. Um, now, am I a conspiracy theorist? Not really, but I really do like a good conspiracy. Um, and one of the best conspiracies that I've seen, because it involves JFK, the moon landing, the Cold War, Kennedy working with the Russians, and a whole bunch of other crazy stuff. Oh yeah, don't forget Freemasons and magicians and
MK Ultra.
and the founding fathers. So I'm referring to a book by Mike Barra, and I don't remember the exact title of the book, but it's something to do with like it has the word conspiracy in it, and it's Mike Barra, Bara. Great book. Yeah, like is any of it even remotely true? I don't know, but he really makes it sound like legit. Like not necessarily that it did happen, but that it could have happened. Like it's very feasible. And I'm basically my judgment is it feasible or not? I don't really care if something's true or not. I want to know if it's feasible or not. And that's kind of the way I write my books too. So in any of my books, it might seem like I'm trying to say this is the way it is, but I'm kind of just assuming if it's this way, what does that mean? So, for example, my book UFOs in the Bible, I basically say that every time that you see something weird in the Bible, it's always a UFO. Do I believe that? Not necessarily, and I'm not saying that in the book. I'm saying if you were to assume that, does this pattern hold up? And I found that yeah, it does. And so it's sort of the same thing with Fermi, where it's like when I started looking at it, I was like, there's something fishy about this Fermi paradox. For one thing, it's not even a paradox. And then when I found out that it wasn't by Fermi, I was like, what? Like obviously there's something weird going on. What is that weird thing? And I still don't really know what that weird thing is. So it seems like somebody was trying to hide something, but I have no idea what they're trying to hide, other than I guess they're just trying to misdirect us into thinking that there's no proof of extraterrestrial life. Well, proof is a hard word. Maybe there isn't any proof of it, but there's sure a ton of evidence. And so that's what that book is about, is looking at that evidence. I don't care, which way you think it, like what result you come to, but I think it is very important to look at that evidence, because right now we've got a situation where we're not allowed to look at it. You don't ask those questions. No, you know what? We're gonna ask those questions.
Very true, Sam. I know I haven't really let you go. Do you have anything you want to ask?
When you were mentioning the Oort cloud, kind of going back to that subject,
Yeah.
do you think it's more to potentially like a debris field, or like almost like a protective barrier from some of the bigger like comets coming through?
Yeah, like that's a good question. Like if assuming it's natural, um, maybe it. Well, I mean, there's a question of functionality, which maybe doesn't make sense to ask in terms of a natural object, because things just are. They don't have to have a reason, but a lot of times they do have a functional region. So if you look at the around Earth, there's this magnetic. They call it the Van Allen belt, and the purpose of that is that it deflects the cosmic rays, so that would ordinarily would kill us. Apparently, again, this is not something that I've really looked into, but I'll take the normal science explanation for it. The Van Allen belts are there. They're caused by the Earth's magnetic field, and they shield us from cosmic rays. Okay, but why? And but it doesn't make sense to ask why, because unless there's a God who put them there to protect us, then what does the what does the idea of why mean? Well, they're there. Like we know that they're there. I mean, I guess you could say the same thing about gravity. Why do we have gravity? Oh, it's to keep us from floating off the earth. Well, no, that's not why they're there. It does do that, and it's very useful. But like in terms of what causes these things, in terms of the Van Allen belt, it seems to have something to do with the way that the Earth is spinning, and because of the iron content of the Earth's core and that molten magma that, like we said earlier, we're just a big hot ball of lava.
Mhm.
Somehow, the way that we're spinning and the fact that we are a metallic object, which is interesting in and of itself, that the Earth is a metallic object when you put it down to the most simple form. That's weird, for one thing, but it does make sense that it would create a magnetic field, because if you take any like a steel rod and you spin it, it creates a magnetic field. That's how car engines and generators and all of that, everything that we have that comes from an electrical technology, is all based around that very simple principle. So I guess it makes a little bit of sense to say why, and then we can take it back to the physics principles behind the phenomenon. When it comes to the Oort cloud, well, we don't yet know very much about the composition of it, or at least I don't. Maybe I'm wrong in estimating our ignorance about the Oort cloud, but it seems really weird to me, and I certainly don't have any kind of inkling on how it's there, let alone why. Let's pretend that it's not. Let's pretend that it's not a natural phenomenon. Let's say somebody put it there. Why would they put it there? Well, yeah, maybe it's some kind of force field. Maybe
Like a net.
is.
It's like some of the asteroids.
Yeah, maybe it's a net. Maybe it's a shielding. Maybe it's just electrically shielding so that signals can't reach us, or certain types of signals, or signals of certain frequencies, because it would have to interact with the wavelength would have to interact with the dimensions of the grid, if it is a grid. And so we have things like Faraday cages, which work on that same principle, where if you take basically take a bunch of wire or any kind of metal frame, you can make essentially a cage. It looks like a cage, and it's made out of conductive metal. If you stand inside it, you get no radio signal. Your cell phone won't work. You'll get no buzz. It's interesting, because what it does is it is essentially, now this is not technically correct, but it's sort of meaningful to say that it basically sucks up the frequencies and grounds them. I could explain it in a way that was scientifically correct, but I don't think I can do that off the cuff, and I would certainly need more illustrations and diagrams. But yeah, so it's possible that the Oort cloud functions as something analogous to that. It's not a Fermi, or it's not a Faraday cage. We know that because radio waves do go through at least certain types, most frequencies. So if it is a Faraday cage, it's only able to filter out a small range of frequencies. Let's put it that way. In which case, if it were designed to be that, then that means that that design is there to specifically round out a very specific type of signal, which is even weirder. So if it's man-made, or not, obviously not man-made, well, maybe man-made, who knows who made it. If somebody made it, they designed it intelligently to do a very specific thing, and it's technology based. I don't think that that's true, but
We
this is
never
the thing.
know.
If you never know,
True.
So if it's not that, then it has to be natural. And as far as I know, we do not have a natural explanation for it. I'm gonna have to check on that because I don't want to be leading your viewers down the garden path here. It's quite
I mean,
possible that there is
fair.
a very, yeah, I don't know.
Not much. That's totally fair. I just like I was thinking about that because yeah, because like I had to look it up because I had to like rebrush myself on where that was because there was also another one or that's like closer and wasn't at the end of the galaxy that was like rumored to be potentially another planet that like kind of like busted apart and then created a debris field, and I wanted to make sure that if that was the one that I was thinking of or not.
Yeah,
But
I might have misunderstood. Yeah, yeah. So which one was that a different one? Does it have another name?
no, I don't know what that one is called. I would have to do some research on that one again. But I was
Uh,
thinking, yeah, I had to look where the org field was and then kind of like see. But no, I definitely it's very interesting because of how far out it is from where from the center is, and like I wanted to see what
Yeah,
your thoughts on that was.
yeah, for sure. So okay, so kind of on a similar topic, I'd like to talk about Nibiru for a minute, if that's okay with you guys. And Keegan,
Sure.
you did mention Planet X.
Hmm.
Um, so this is kind of an interesting topic to me because, of course, it ties into Zechariah Sitchin, and we had also talked earlier a little bit about sourcing and you know having good documentation and footnotes. And so this is one thing where I always throw Sitchin under the bus for because he does zero footnotes, he does zero referencing, and he doesn't tell us what any of his sources are. And so he'll say something like, uh, the Sumerian tablets say blah blah blah, and he'll just make a statement. Well, he doesn't tell us which Sumerian tablets, what the context was in which they said the certain thing, if they said that, um, and how does he know they even said that? Because most of the time he doesn't even talk about like the translating aspects of it. He does get into the translating stuff a little bit when it suits his need. So, he'll talk about how the word Shem means rocket, and he'll go on and on and on about that. But he still doesn't tell us how he came to that conclusion, um, and he also doesn't really tell us why everybody else disagrees with him. And he certainly doesn't tell us which of the Sumerian myths he's referring to when he's telling us these stories. Now, I've been able to piece together some of this stuff by going back to the sources. So I've actually written a book on the Enuma Elish, which is one of the Sumerian creation myths. And I'm also currently writing a book on the Atrahasis epic, which is typically which is understood as the Sumerian version or Babylonian version of the flood, the Great Flood. And it is that, but it's actually so much more than that. Now, in both of these books, there's very, very strong indication that the Sumerian they're called gods in the normal translations, but the Sumerians did not have the word God, obviously, and it's not. It doesn't seem true to me that the Sumerians thought of these people as gods in the sense that, like, well, what do we even mean by gods? Like, because usually the word God is not plural, it's God, like the Christian God. But obviously, it's not that because there's more than one of them. So, what do we even mean? Well, okay, well, let's think about like Greek gods and Roman gods. Okay, we kind of get that. It's really like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. These are a whole bunch of heroes doing cool stuff in stories. So that's the concept of the Roman and the Greek gods, and it sort of fits a little bit with the Sumerian concept, but still, the Sumerians aren't really thinking of them as like great like heroes necessarily, although that is sort of an aspect of it. And they're not exactly worshiping them either, although that is sort of an aspect of it. But really, what they're doing is they're telling stories of these characters. So I think the word God is it's too loaded with a lot of baggage. So if we use the word characters instead, well, that's definitely true. These are characters. They're people in stories doing something. But the interesting thing in the Sumerian myths is that there are a number of these characters, and they're not human, and yet they act like humans. They do a lot of the same kinds of things that humans do. They run businesses. They get into arguments. They form unions. They go to their bosses, and they have basically they go on strike. These are parts of the things that are happening in the Sumerian myth. And another part of it is that they actually create humans. So this is interesting. So you have now a bunch of human-like people, for lack of a better word, who create the humans, and they teach them how to do stuff. They teach them how to use fire. They teach them how to use language, how to do farming, and basically they hire them as their like farmhands, essentially, greatly simplifying this. The other interesting fact about them is they come from a different planet, or not necessarily a planet even, but they come from elsewhere. And there's the narrative describes them flying through space, flying back and forth through space, making measurements, which I interpret as in my book, the Enuma Elish. It basically interprets it as the setting up of a database with new data in a new location, which you would have to do when you're exploring anywhere. Even still now, not that there's a ton of exploring going on, but when Columbus and those guys were doing their exploring, one of the main primary things they had to do was to make maps. And to make those maps, they would have to take a lot of measurements. It's really important to make a map when you're exploring because you do want to get home again. And that is a lot of description in the Enuma Elish goes around the setting up of these this data with these measurements and setting up these maps. And part of that, it involves an idea called Nibiru. It's actually a location, but it's not the location of a planet. It's not where any of those guys were from, but it is a location on a map. And that map is actually the zodiac. So remember earlier we talked about the solar system being a disk spinning around like this. The zodiac is not a calendar. The zodiac is a star map, and that star map was required because these guys were traveling through space, and they needed to get a precise location of where their goal was and where their new home of Earth and how it ties in with the rest of the galaxy. And that's what Nibiru is Nibiru is actually the point where this plane, the spinning of the solar system, crosses the plane of the Milky Way galaxy. They're at a weird angle, and so if you're standing on Earth and you look up in the night sky, you can see the Milky Way. You can see it like it's actually there. But then if you also think about the horizon, or sorry, the equator of Earth, and well, there's actually two things. The Earth's equator is also tilted at an angle to the so-called solar equator, which is this flat disk. basically, in order to make these calculations to figure out where the heck you are, you have to use some pretty advanced math. I have tried standing up, looking at the Milky Way, and trying to figure out which way the sun is, and it's really hard to do. Like, I get so confused. So, so that these guys basically had computer systems and databases which they were entering this data into, and Nibiru was this anchoring point in space where at least two of those lines, imaginary lines, crossed. Again, Sitchin will say, "Oh, well, Nibiru was a planet, and then it got destroyed." Well, okay, so yeah, I mean, there was a planet that got destroyed. It's where the asteroid belt is now. There was probably a planet there, but it's pretty clear to me that that debris is still there. It's not floating out on a 37,000 year orbit. It's not on a highly elliptical orbit. And even if there is another object that did get kicked into such an orbit, you can't survive on a crazy orbit like that. Because sometimes you're going to be coming in close to the sun. Oh, yeah, it's nice. It's a nice day. It's all sunny. And then for the next 37,000 years, you're going to be stuck in a frigid wasteland where it's basically probably going to plummet down to absolute zero very quickly, and everything will break. I live in Canada, and when it gets to minus 30, everything breaks. So I don't even want to think about minus 372.
It's like the day the earth stood still.
True.
Or not that, the day after tomorrow.
Yeah.
Mixing up day movies.
Day movies. Well, yeah.
I'd be worse than the day after tomorrow.
Well, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how we think of gods. I mean, when you said gods, I honestly thought about the new gods from DC because I've been reading some of those lately. But also a movie that keeps popping up in my head as we talk about different topics is Prometheus and like the engineers and stuff.
Yeah, man. So that's my favorite movie of all time. I mean, I love lots of movies, but that is definitely number one for me. And so and sort of continuing on with the story in Alien Covenant as well, like basically this, you kind of have to watch both of those films because they're telling different stories, but they're the same story, a kind of a twist on each other. And the idea of like this life form that is able to adapt and change, the robots in the Aliens series are always going on how they're it's the perfect life form or whatever. I can't remember the exact line. It is a very interesting idea that there's this thing. It's easy to call it, just say it's a life form, but then even then we're now relying on what we think about what is a life form. And so I want to look underneath that. I want to look under the hood of what is a life form. And man, it's really interesting. So here's some more crazy stuff that I've found in my research. Again, now there's going to be some stuff that is going to be conjecture, and some of it which is like normal proven science that they teach in university. I'll start with that. So what you don't know, if you haven't taken university level biology courses, which I have not done, but I stumbled across this information and double checked it with a bunch of my biologist friends, and they were like, "Oh yeah, that's right." This is really crazy. So you know how your body is made out of cells? Now there's all kinds of different cells. Like a skin cell is different than a hair cell. It's different than the cells in your eyeball. It's different than a neuron in your brain. So there's different kinds of cells, but basically they sort of all have these features in common. So it's like kind of like a balloon almost, you can think of it. It's got like a membrane around it. So it's a self-contained space. it's got a bunch of stuff inside it. And one of the things inside it is called the nucleus, which is sort of conceptualized as the center, but it's not really like spatially, it's not in the center necessarily. It may or may not be. But there's one nucleus in every cell. That's important. And the nucleus is where our DNA is. So when your cells, when a cell splits, it kind of goes like this, and you've probably seen this in any kind of, even in like grade 6 biology, you would have seen this. So your cell is now 2 cells. Okay, cool. Now each of those has a nucleus and a bunch of other stuff, because when they split, the nucleus itself also split. And so that's how our bodies regenerate. Every day you're losing thousands or possibly millions of cells off your skin, and they're regrowing underneath. And every time that's happening, these cells are splitting, and your DNA is going into both of the cells. Sometimes when that happens, the DNA gets messed up. That's what we know as I can't think of the word, but basically that's how evolution works, is that there's mutations, right? So that allows creatures to eventually, over long periods of time, to evolve. Most of the time, it's pretty much like, yep, here's one. Oh, now there's 2, and they're basically exactly the same. So that's kind of the basic biology that we're taught in high school. What they're not telling us is this other part. And it has to do with a thing called organelles, one of which you've probably remember hearing about, which is called the mitochondria. Mitochondria is called the powerhouse of the cell. Well, it is because functionally, it's the only part of our entire bodies that actually knows how to burn oxygen. So it's really powerhouse. Yeah, I mean, yes, but it's burning. It's more like an engine. Like it's literally burning the fuel, oxygenizing the food that we eat. And so the interesting thing here is that in each cell, there is one nucleus, but there's not one mitochondria. There's actually hundreds of mitochondria in each cell. And why would that be? Oh, well, that's because we need lots of fuel, so we need lots of power. Oh, okay, that makes sense. But wait, in each mitochondria, so let's say there's 100 mitochondria in this one skin cell. Inside each of those mitochondria is also DNA. So it's not the DNA that's in your nucleus. And the mitochondrial DNA is not the same as human DNA. Mitochondria have DNA that is not human. So the mitochondria, and they're actually only one species that are living inside your cells. There's hundreds of mitochondria in each cell, but there's also hundreds of these other organelles that have different names. And I don't know a lot about those other ones. I just know that generically, there's all these organelles. They all have, some of them don't have DNA. Some of them are just like kind of lumps of machines or whatever that do whatever we need them to do to create protein or whatever. But a lot of them actually have their own DNA as well. So inside each human cell, you have this whole microcosm of non-human living beings. They have their own DNA, and in fact, some of them multiply independently of the cell multiplication. So our cell divides and multiplies, but meanwhile, even when within the single cell, these other mitochondria and other organelles are dividing and doing their own DNA division and doing their own evolution inside our cell. Like, this is insane. So there's like basically this whole forest of creatures inside every single cell in my body. There are alien life forms in your body. You are already that perfect creature that we've seen in Prometheus, and you are created out of a whole bunch of these things glommed all together. And the theory is that a long time ago there was just one of these little guys came along and ate one of the other one, and they would just digest it, right? One day he decided, oh, instead of digesting it, actually I'm gonna tame this guy to get him to work for me. So it's pretty much the same type of thing as animal domestication, where the dogs tamed us or the cats tamed us. I don't know who tamed us, but they didn't do a very good job because we're not very tame yet. So there's all these things where it's like, this is going on inside your body, and it's changing too, because the human body is not a static environment, really. I mean, look, every time we eat a hamburger, we're putting something into that body that was not available to our ancestors. And so there's different, I'll say chemicals. I don't like that word, but I mean, there's different types of matter that we ingest now that our ancestors would not have. I mean, sugar is a good example. If you look how much sugar is in the average diet right now, compared to, a few generations ago, it's insane how different that was. And so we know that it's causing changes in human biology and psychology. We probably don't know like the details, and a lot of that is because it's really complicated, and frankly a lot of it is because of lobbying and suppressing that information. I think that caffeine is probably a very, very terrible thing to put inside your body, yet most of us are consuming it on a daily basis. I know that sugar is bad, but I still eat a little bit of it. But I can tell a big difference when I go off sugar for a few weeks. Even carbohydrates. Sometimes I go onto a keto diet. I feel way better. My body works totally differently. And the interesting thing about keto is that it's actually quite well documented that your body actually does kick into a different mode of basically it's still using those mitochondria to burn the fuel and to create energy, but it takes the fuel from a different storage reservoirs in your body. It moves your I can't think of the word. Basically, like there's kind of two modes. You could be running on gas, or you could be running on electric. That's like a hybrid car. Your body is like a hybrid car in that regard, but it's also like a forest full of little animals. So there's just a lot of weird shit that we don't think about things that way, but it doesn't mean that they're not necessarily true. And I have no idea where I'm going with this, but I thought it was interesting.
No, it's definitely interesting. It reminds me of like that old saying, like if you replace planks in a ship, day by day, is it still the same ship? And it's kind of like our body, because our cells are always like replacing. So by what point are you a different person in a way? So, I mean, you touched upon one movie. Is there any other like extraterrestrial or alien movies you actually really enjoy?
Well, I mean, the whole Alien franchise, I just love it. The Predator ones are pretty good too, but for a different reason. They're just a good entertaining. If it bleeds, we can kill it. Like, who doesn't love Arnold? Uh, but of course, the Terminator movies are great. I like Star Wars. Um, I don't know. I like a lot of sci-fi.
Yeah, no, maybe one point because we've been doing some deep dives on movies. We'll have to have you on to talk Prometheus, and we'll really do a deep dive on that. We
Sure, that'd be awesome.
recently, yeah, no, we would love that, and especially because you like it so much, so we always like to have people that have that passion about it. Um,
Yeah,
we recently
It's
watched
funny because
oh no,
sorry, I'm part of a group on Facebook that it's like the Wayland Utani group, and so it's mostly shit talk about all the other movies because most of the guys on there like the first movie Alien and the second movie Aliens, and they kind of hate all the other movies, so it's sort of entertaining. But I think that the whole franchise is really great. um, the interesting thing about it is that each of the movies appeals to a different type of person. uh, they're almost a different genre in every movie. um, so you've got your horror, you've got your action thriller, you've got your sort of more of like a drama, I guess, a little bit in some of them. And then you've got in the later ones, you really get into the theme stuff more. So these themes that are sort of always been there, but in the later couple of movies, they are really just all about that theme and exploring that theme, and that's really what I like about why I like Prometheus and Alien Covenant the most, is because they are really digging into that theme. Um, and in Covenant, you've got that whole thing about like um, the purposeful creation and manipulation of the evolution of that species. But in Prometheus, you have sort of the start and the origin of that species in a more natural form. But yeah, either way, they're really interesting. And you know, um, again, it also brings you back to the concept of where did life begin, and did life on Earth start because a biological weapon got released accidentally? Maybe. I mean, it actually works. Like, I'm not saying that that's like that's even what I think is true, but it's feasible. And again, this is the kind of thing that really it grabs my imagination, and I think that's why, like, in a way, I kind of blur the lines between fiction and nonfiction because I see that fiction is designed to grab your imagination, but I think that nonfiction should also be designed that way. And that's sort of how I write my nonfiction. Is like it really is a what if. Even if it's nonfiction, it can still be what if. And I think a lot of people um, are really sort of married to their ideas, and I'm I'm not. I find that like kind of uninteresting. Like, I would rather explore other ideas. I guess I'm having affairs on my ideas instead of being married to them. My ideas are my mistresses.
yeah. So we watched a movie recently, and I'm not sure if you've watched it. It's supposed to be a documentary, but I have some feelings about it. It's
Okay,
called Two Face the Gray, and I don't know if you've seen the footage.
I haven't seen it. No.
Okay, I mean, I went
So it's
well.
obviously it's about the gray aliens.
I mean, supposedly.
Yeah.
It's actually the second part of a trilogy, and the footage started off as a purported ghost footage.
Okay.
But I went to the lengths of like actually contacting the Sydney Harbor to see if this island shut down. So I think maybe I went too far. But when going through your stories and stuff, how do you pick the ones that you think have fact versus the ones you think have fiction?
Okay. Like, in terms of researching?
Yeah, because obviously there's
Well,
tons of stories, and you gotta like whittle them down to like, okay, this one has a good enough of evidence, perhaps.
Right. Okay, so it's different depending on the topic that you're looking into, and this kind of ties back to the different types of research paradigms that exist in academia as well. I mean, sometimes I rag on the academics, but they're not doing everything wrong, and a lot of I'm a university trained guy myself, so there's a lot of really good methodologies that I think it helps to be aware of. So, for example, there's the difference between quantitative and qualitative research, and so what that means is in quantitative, you're dealing with numbers. So you're going to be looking at math. You're gonna be having formulas. You'll be able to plug in variables and come out with calculations. And so this is what physics is all about. In the strictest sense, physics is all about formulas. Now, chemistry is kind of builds on top of physics, and it works similar, although there's still formulas, but there's it's more mechanical in a way. And on top of that, you've got biology, which is still chemistry, but it's a certain type of chemistry, and you're kind of focusing on certain types of reactions. Metabolism, that's the word I was trying to think of earlier when I was talking about keto. So keto has well-documented metabolism, which is basically a different type of chemistry, or a different, so your biology uses chemistry in order to do stuff, and it can switch between two different chemical formulas, if you will. Again, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but so you've got physics, which is like your laws of physics, gravity. Then you've got chemistry, which is like, okay, knowing what we know about those laws, how does stuff actually work? And so what kind of stuff? Oh, well, different kinds of atoms. Oh, okay, so different kinds of molecules, and that's your whole chemistry. Then what types? Okay, well, what about these really complicated molecules that really seem to mostly have these carbon and hydrogen, oxygen, and there's these patterns? Oh yeah, well, that's biology, and it's the chemistry of life is what it is, and really all it is physics up a notch, up another notch, because it's all still working on the laws of physics, within the laws of physics, but in really complicated ways. So a biologist isn't thinking about the physics, but it is running on it. He may or may not know, but probably most biologists didn't even study physics, and that's fine, because life is complicated, everything's complicated. You have to be able to focus on some stuff. So you've got all of this really hard sciencey stuff, okay, right? Then now let's take a slight switch over to the more softer side of sciences, like psychology. Well, psychology is still science, and it's still based on formulas. Maybe, is it? Well, maybe not formulas, but maybe patterns. Okay, so let's take another step over farther past that and look at sociology and even economics. So these are kinds of fields where it's not even about how one person works. So how does a thing work? Well, how does a person work? Well, how does a group of people work? Well, how does a society work? Well, how does the economics of that society work? How does the politics of that work? And so these are all still built on the harder stuff, but they're kind of so far removed that it's hard to even really notice that they are. And so in these kinds of fields, the numbers are maybe not as useful. Now, there's still a lot of numbers involved because you have to look at statistics, and things like that. But you're also looking at, well, stories. And so a story is, in a way, the opposite of a number, because, give me the hard facts. How many planets are there in the solar system? Well, 9. Okay, yeah, but what about, remember there's a story about how Pluto used to be a planet and then it wasn't, and then, oh, well, so even now, we can't even use a purely mathematical view to explain how many planets there are in our solar system. We have to start relying on these qualitative methods, which is the opposite of quantitative. So now it's a qualitative method. And it basically comes down to people's experiences. And not only that, but the experiences of groups of people. And this is really where ufology starts to come. And because we're now looking at people's experiences, and they're also a group experience because we're noticing that there's all these patterns that are similar. If everybody who experienced a UFO saw something completely different, it would be a very different field. It would be very individually based, and I would really have to approach it a different way. And I probably wouldn't have approached it at all because it's just too nebulous. But when we see that there are all these patterns, then we can sort of use them as almost a statistical approach, where we're saying, 50% of UFO sightings in the 1950s were saucer shaped. So you can start to put numbers back into it. Now, a guy like me, I like to have some numbers because that's something with a very well-defined value. I have a hard time sometimes thinking about something if I can't define it, right? I mean, I guess that's sort of similar for everyone. Yeah, you have to know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know what you're thinking about at least. How can you think about it if you don't know what it is?
Right.
But yeah, like it depends. So in terms of the Fermi book, it's pretty quantitative. Like there's a lot of hard science data, and so for that, I used a ton of references. And this comes back to your question about like really fact checking is really what it comes down to. And so on quantitative topics, because they are fact-based or evidence-based, they are generally very well documented. And so I can put in a bunch of I don't know how many footnotes are in that book, maybe 200. And so each of those footnotes itself will take you to either to a book or a paper or to like another web page or a Wikipedia article or something like that. And all of those references themselves contain a whole bunch of footnotes themselves. So on that side of things, on the quantitative side of science, there's this huge, vast, cross-referenced web of facts, and you can go down a rabbit hole in a way, but it's not really a rabbit hole that you fall down. It's a rabbit web that takes you around and round, and you see a lot of really interesting things, and it might bring you right back to where you were because they're all interrelated. And as you do that, and as you spend a lot of time like looking into that stuff and reading that stuff, you begin to get this model in your mind that has a similar structure, where in your mind there's all these ideas that are related, which is not something you can get off of watching a YouTube video or listening to a thing, or even just reading a book, because it's linear. So this whole reference-based world that I live in most of the time is non-linear. It's all it's this big knot of information. But on the other hand, some people are just trying to tell a story, and a story is kind of mostly linear because it's about they got up one day and they were on their way to work, and they saw this crazy thing in the sky, and it made them feel a certain way. And then they went and they told their friend, and their friend told them about another story that was similar. And their friend said, "Yeah, I believe you." And then they were able to go, maybe this was real. And then they decided to write it in their journal. And then 50 years later, their journal was discovered, and it became somehow got into the public domain, or like the knowledge of the public.
The
So,
zeitgeist.
right, yeah. And so even though this is a very different kind of data, it's still data. And in a way, it's you could almost think of it as more reliable, because it's got a person attached to it. It's got a personality, and a person with their relationships and how it affects those relationships, because a lot of times it does have a profound effect on the relationships of people. And and because of that, it has weight. It has a value that just a purely numeric data maybe doesn't have, because now you've got somebody who's invested their life into this, and they're standing by their story. To me, that's really huge. So, but the problem with that is it's difficult to document. So I don't have footnotes in the Before Roswell book. There's maybe a couple footnotes, certainly not the 200 that are in Fermi. And it's just a string of anecdotes, and then a little bit of analysis as to how I can sort of parcel those anecdotes into certain analytical, like, it's not even really a framework. I'm just sort of putting some tags on them, I guess, basically. Um, and basically, oh, here's another saucer. Oh, here's another round one. Oh, this one's red. Oh, this one's silver, right? So there are things that you can do to analyze them, but even those attributes are not as firmly defined as the quantitative stuff. Because silver, how do you define silver? Well, silver is a really tough one because it's kind of reflecty. It's sort of like every color, depending on what's behind you. Red is a little bit easier. I kind of know what red is, but do I? Is it like red like fire, or is it red like a fire truck? Those are different kinds of red. Is it like when somebody says it's a fire? Is it like a fire because it's glowing? Is it a fire because it's hot? Is it a fire because it's moving like weirdly, or is it shimmery? So these are all of the words that come up in these experience-based depictions. Every single word has a little bit more variance and a little bit of nebulosity. So it makes it very interesting, especially when you have something that's like a cigar shape. Well, what the hell is a cigar shape? I mean, I've seen a cigar. I guess it's like a shape like that. But is it like this, or is it like this? Or like, because how cigar shaped does it have to be before it turns into rod shaped, which again sometimes comes up. And so there's these vagaries of language that you sometimes have to do a little bit of guessing. And also, it seems that sometimes these are influenced by, like you said, the zeitgeist, and the zeitgeist of the time is going to influence the descriptions, if not the perceptions. But it might also influence the perceptions.
Yeah, I think the zeitgeist, I mean, it's always interesting to try to, and this is something we've done with a UFO cryptid case with the Flatwoods monster. And it's like, how much of that story is really the story and how much of it is the zeitgeist, like what people have created after.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of times that's where ufology perhaps of the three paranormal fields is almost the most difficult to research, because really at the end of the day, unless you have an actual piece of debris, which is fantastic, but obviously it doesn't happen, it's going to be just
Doesn't
stories,
happen very often.
or that we're told
Does
about, I
happen.
should say. I mean,
Okay.
I'm definitely on board with Roswell. Compare it to like cryptozoology, which for the most part is probably just misidentifications, but at least you can go out there and actually physically study it. And then probably second is like ghosts and spirits, because like you said, they're in one location. So at least you know, hey, I'm gonna go look for it. It's here. Ufology, on the other hand, you're like, our buddy, he grew up on the Navajo reservation. He outside of Phoenix, he saw the Phoenix lights. So we have this really fantastic story. Obviously, there's footage of it, but if you go there today, you're not gonna like re-see it, and that's kind of the
Right.
frustrating point or part of like ufology.
Yeah, exactly. It's there and it's gone.
Hmm.
I mean, that the same is true of cryptids. Um, I mean, I want to believe in Bigfoot, uh, and I sort of do, but it's hard,
Yeah,
right? you know, and some of these other things, like I don't know what to think about the Mothman. Like, to me, it seems, I hate to use the word, but it seems crazy to me, you know. But it's like I don't. I'm certainly not calling the people who saw it. I'm not calling them crazy. But the concept is like I don't. That's not. I don't know how to fit that into my framework of concepts. I mean, to me, it also sort of brings you into less of a paranormal thing and more of the, I guess, the more of a mythological. Like, okay, I'm thinking of. To me, it's not a giant leap to go from Mothman to vampirism. No, don't get me wrong. I actually believe in vampires more than I believe in Mothman. But like, there's this sort of this, like, I guess, a bit of a continuum in terms of what these stories are and their their similarities and their differences. And yeah, there's so many different things. But if you look worldwide, there's actually a lot of different cultural references in different cultures and different mythologies that are very similar to the kind of the classic vampire tale. Mind you, there's also a lot that are kind of similar to the Mothman, or other types of flying beasts and dragons and the Thunderbird, and so there's so many different things that you got to wonder: are these well, why do we have different versions of things that are similar, or are they actually talking about the same thing?
yeah. I mean, I
Even
totally
in
understand about like the wanting to believe, because I told Sam the other day, I was like, I 100% want to believe like the Kasai Rex or the Mekele Mbembe is out there, but for the Kasai Rex to be out there, like there's so many leaps, like because obviously Tyrannosaurus didn't live in Africa. Dinosaurs have been gone for 66 million years. I mean, and the photographs we have were clearly faked. And it's kind of fascinating because like pictures back in the day were actually easier to fake than they are today.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, I definitely want to believe, and I 100% hope they're out there. But then you got to like reel it back in and like, okay, but can it be?
right. Well, I mean, anything can, but the I think the stumbling block for me is that that there's people out there lying about stuff, and it's really frustrating. Like, why the hell do people got to do that? Um, and okay, it's fucking hilarious. Uh-huh. Yeah, shut up. Like, I don't know.
Or
It's
people can make a lot of money off of it too.
well, I guess that's certainly that has been the case. People are a very unpredictable factor in all of these things.
Yeah, and again, going back to your book, that's what I enjoyed is because you put so much work into like the scientific stuff. And okay, well, this is here and this is here. So there's a lot of facts to get to your conclusion. And I really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you. What would you say was my conclusion? Because I'm not entirely sure myself. I guess I kind of know.
I mean, I feel like the title, the
Yeah,
title
okay.
definitely kind of gives it away, right? I mean, you definitely think Fermi's paradox wasn't, I mean, is it a paradox? Isn't, yeah, I guess you're right.
It's not.
Because getting
I
towards the
mean,
end, you're like, it's a weird thing because is it actually a paradox or do we just think it's a paradox?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think I said a couple of times in that book that basically this is the real paradox, and then
Mhm.
it's something completely different, right? Um, but yeah, I think it's like for me, I treat my books as an exercise in what if, and I already said that I think, um, but I guess by the end of Fermi's paradox is bullshit. It seems like there's a lot of evidence that is basically saying they are here and they are out there and um, like
Well, and they've
really
been here because I know you've
they've
brought up,
been here.
especially with your previous book, you reference that a few times, where obviously if there's these stories before, like what changed? Like why were they? You
Yeah,
know?
yeah. So, you know, I guess I am a UFO believer, but I'm not 100%. I'm like maybe somewhere in the 90s. But I write as though I'm 100% because that you know that's sort of where I'm getting at. But even as I'm doing that, um, I try to make each of my books be. I'm not trying to lead you somewhere. I'm trying to allow you to see sort of the same journey that I did as I was starting to look at this without knowing where it was going to go. Well, they always end up going the same place, but it's not because I'm necessarily trying to make that happen. Or am I? I don't know.
No, it kind of seems like the J. Allen Hynek path of like skeptic. Okay, but I'm open to the possibility to, okay, this is where the facts are leading to me, to where like
Yeah,
Hynek obviously believed at the end that UFOs were out there.
I think so. Um, yeah, and to
Found
me,
out.
another. Were you going to say something, Sam?
I think he kind of like started to figure that out like probably before the end. Like after like a couple of like run throughs, depending on which ones they were, which I guess cases they were. He probably was just like, no, there's something definitely not like hoaxy or unnatural or
Yeah,
unhumanistic about it.
yeah, I think so too, and I think that at some point he began to realize that um, that he was basically being told what conclusion he was allowed to have, and I think that rubbed him the wrong way, and probably pushed him more into the side of believing it, which is a good thing.
Mhm.
Um, and another interesting guy from history that sort of is in the same boat is Carl Jung, and a lot of people will talk about Carl Jung's thoughts on UFOs. And he did write, uh, I'm not sure if it was a book, certainly a chapter or two on the subject. And he was really interested in determining whether it was a physical phenomenon or whether, like, sort of like we were talking about earlier a bit about like the mass hysteria or the mass um, hallucinations. Like he was really interested in kind of getting to the bottom of what role perception played, because it certainly does play a role. And of course, as a psychologist, Jung was very interested in the perception, probably more so than even the actual phenomenon itself, or the actual physical, if there was something physical there. So he had a very different approach from probably most ufologists, and he is often quoted, or essentially a lot of people writing about Jung's perspective on the topic will, I'll say, misconstrue, or basically there's this concept, this idea floating around that really Jung believed that this whole thing was just a psychic phenomenon, or there's various languaging around it, but essentially that there was nothing real, and that it was in people's heads, essentially, which is certainly a lot of the stuff that he talked about, and he was very interested in getting through that, and looking at that, and really examining that. But what most people do not mention, and probably because they don't know, because again, it's been kind of misconstrued for quite a long time, is that by the end of his investigations, Carl Jung concluded that there is actually something physical at play in all of these various cases that he examined, and certainly perception plays a role, but there's something real here, something physical, and it's not simply a manifestation of a archetype, whatever that means. And so I think that it's interesting that that was the conclusion that he eventually came to, and also interesting that part is left out of any discussions around it normally. So basically, Fermi's paradox is bullshit, and so is most of the stuff that most people are saying about the UFO phenomenon. There's just so much misinformation.
Yeah, before you leave today, and it's been a wonderful conversation, so thank you for joining us, but where can our viewers go find your stuff and help support you?
For sure. Thanks for asking. My main website is dimensionfold.com. That's Dimension Fold, as if it's two words, but just shove them right together. And on there, you'll see a link to probably one of my most recent books will be near the top. It's actually my publishing company main page as well, so there's a whole bunch of other stuff on there that's not related to my own stuff, but I try to keep my stuff pretty visible near the top. And it's got, you'll have a link to my YouTube channel, as well as my new Substack channel, which you can subscribe to both of those. That'd be great. And once you navigate a little bit in there, you'll find all of my books as well. You can also just search me on Amazon. My name is Ken Goudsward. Ken, G-O-U, there's my spelling right there. Search me on Amazon, and yeah, I've got a whole bunch of books on there. Stuff about Sumerian mythology, stuff about the Bible, stuff about UFOs, and a couple of novels as well, a sci-fi novel and a dark comedy.
And I will make sure to be a good host and put them in the description. So just go down to the description and you guys will be able to find all the stuff. And no, we've had a fun time. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. And we look forward
definitely.
We look forward to talking to you more about before Roswell and Roswell itself too, because I tried my best not to go there because I was like, well, I feel like we'll definitely go there then. So
yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining us, and I definitely look forward to talking to you here soon.
Great. Thanks. It was really great to meet you guys. We'll talk again.
So once again, we want to say thank you to Ken for joining us on this latest episode of Culz Interviews and discussing some of his latest books. Like we said throughout the episode, we'll actually be having him back on in a couple weeks, along with Barbara DeLong, to talk about their book Before Roswell. So if you want to keep up to date, we'll put all of Ken's links in the description below, so make sure to go check it out, support it. Obviously, we had a ton of fun with his books because we talked for almost 3 hours, so it couldn't have been bad, and I definitely would say go check it out. I recommend it. And yeah, for more Culz interviews, though, check out that link to your left. For more about Culz Paranormal, click that link to your right. And don't forget to hit that like and give us a subscribe. And let us know, have you read Fermi's Paradox's bullshit?